Hello, and welcome back from lunch, and welcome to beautiful Pacific Northwest. I love sunny days. I am local. So there's been so many DDoSes, and so I've been working in the security industry probably for about 15, 20 years. I started my networking career actually building a backbone FDDI for the National Institute of Health. So I always say that I'm a networking person that got interested in security because it absolutely touches everything. And we really have to pay attention, and now we have to keep paying attention. And so whenever I have discussions about, wow, look at this latest DDoS, I'm like, I'm not really sure that it's something new. And so I started looking at what the trends were, especially when I first got started in the mid-90s. And some of the stuff really surprised me. I'm like, yep, I really want to bring awareness that in some ways it's the same old things that we really haven't been paying attention to. And what can we all collectively do to make sure that we help overall to get rid of what we can in terms of these denial of service attacks. So basically, I'm going to give a historical viewpoint of my point of view, from my personal experiences, and then look at the trend in recent years and even the recent months, and look at what mitigation techniques are available, and really talk about also our collective responsibility. Because one of the things that I've seen in the last 10, 15 years, that everybody's always pointing fingers that it's the other person's problem, it's what they're not doing. But really, it's collectively all of our problem. So I decided to start off with this. So, IPv4 header, it could be an IPv6 header, or, look at a TCP or UDP header. And basically, you change any bit of any byte, and you could have a potential DDoS. Right? Because equipment might not know what to do with that malformed packet, or if you're changing some other parameter, you might be causing amplification attacks. And so the reason that you're never going to get rid of DDoS attacks is because you're going to have protocols, you're going to have implementations, and basically any kind of bug or any kind of malicious maneuvering of header information, right, or data can cause denial of service attacks. And in DDoS, absolutely everything is fair game, right? It doesn't matter what quote unquote layer you're operating in. And so what makes it so difficult to handle these types of attacks is because you don't really know where they're going to be coming from and what protocol misuse is going to cause you all of this unwanted packet love, right? And these days, there are hundreds of gigabits per second. And I know some tier 1 guys are always like, oh yeah, just throw more bandwidth at it, yeah, use some more, wavelengths. And I'm like, that's great for you, but what about countries that may only have 10 megs to their entire country? Right? It used to be, back in, 10, 15 years ago, Bhutan, right? I think they had a 2 meg satellite link to their country. And so, when I was advising them on what to do, I'm like, you gotta filter. Because for you guys, filtering is really important because you only want to let legitimate traffic in. So we really do have to understand what's going on. And one of the trends that I've seen in later years is that people don't really understand how their networks work anymore. So there's a lot of times that, I'm asking people, so, how does your DDoS, how do your DNS traffic actually, what does it traverse? They're like, well, it goes through the authoritative servers. Yeah, but I'm like, where does it actually go? Do you have forwarders? Do you even know? And a lot of people don't. And so we have to go back to the basics to really understand how the protocols operate within our environments. And the attack motivators, they're still largely the same, right? There's greed, there's people that just want to do it for pranks, there's notoriety, hey, look, I caused a DDoS and caused Dine and Twitter and all these guys to go down. There's revenge, hey, I don't like you, this happens a lot in the gaming industries. There's just ignorance, right? Hey, what does this script do, right? Oh, did I cause that? And then, the worst ones, though, these days there are a lot of state-sponsored attacks that go on. Right, so the criminal infrastructure has gotten really sophisticated over the last 10, 15 years. So, there's many targeted attacks that are ongoing. And so in some way, I look at the world today, right? I mean, we used to have vigilantes in the Wild West, right? It's now happening in cyberspace. And so really, there's many motivators, and who really cares what the motivation is, right? The fact is that you have so much traffic, you have services that aren't available, and how do you get them back online again, and how do you actually mitigate as best you can any of these DDoS attacks? As I mentioned before, protocols will always have flaws, right? We're human. Humans design the protocols. Same with implementations, right? We have to get better at error checking. And my little pet peeve is always, it has to start in school, right? You get an A for getting traffic to pass through and getting the right answer at the end of your little piece of code that you write. Well, what about error checking, right? Does anybody check that? Does anybody care? And so another pet peeve I have is that implementations have really poor default settings. It was a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, I was looking at one device and I was going, what's the default device hardening configuration that you have? And I was shocked to see that Telnet was on by default. Okay? And this is not an IoT device. This was a network infrastructure device. So, these attacks are going to occur, and collectively we have to look at what do we need to do to get the implementations to be much more sound. What can we as operators do to also make sure that our configurations are sound for device hardening, and how are we part of the problem? So I wrote a Cisco press book on security. It came out in 1999, and the second edition came out in 2003. So I was kind of curious last year, what did I write about DDoS, back in 99? I'm like, nothing. Why? Because you didn't have one. Because you had distributed attacks, but you didn't yet have, you had denial of service attacks, but they weren't yet distributed, right? Because it wasn't yet sophisticated enough. And so you had things that some of these will look familiar in current DDoSes that we see, right? You had the ping of death. So the attacker sends, ping packets that are larger than the largest packet that was accepted at the time. Fragmentation would result in larger reassembled packets, and it caused devices to just not know how to handle it, and they would freeze or reboot. LAN C, get a lot of TCP SYN spoof traffic, right? TCP SYN spoofing still happens today. Smurf attack. Right? A large number of ICMP packets were sent, and you just end up sending too much traffic. This, by the way, caused a lot of folks to just say, oh, ICMP is bad, so, I'm just going to, filter all ICMP packets, which, of course, once people started playing with IPv6 and they started mimicking all their configurations, they're like, oh, v6 is so awful, it doesn't work. Well, no, it works. It's just that you don't understand it because you're filtering all your ICMP traffic. And really, you need to have some specific ICMP traffic for neighbor discovery and route discovery, right, and path MTU discovery. So we really have to understand what attacks in the past were causing some of our configurations, that we have, and that we don't just blindly mimic everything. But we really need to have an understanding of why things work the way they do. Fraggle, I have a typo in here. So charge N is actually UDP port 19. But again, it was using the Smurf attack and using different port numbers, or teardrop. So I think all of you know this, right? DDoS, right? Basically using a number of different machines distributed at this point around the world. Now it can be up to 1 million machines, and you just target one victim. So it was interesting because really in 1999, to the best of my knowledge, was really the first distributed attack, and that was Trinu. And a friend of mine who actually lives here and works at the University of Washington, Dave Dietrich, is the one that basically did the first analysis of it. And so it used special ports and communications and utilized UDP and ICMP port unreachable messages. But again, it was one of the first that I'm aware of where it used different daemons, different machines, and was the first distributed denial of service attack. And so it had a bunch of variants, right? People got more sophisticated and smarter. And what I think is really interesting is, when you're attacking a network, right, when you want to cause damage, you don't want to be detected, right? Because once you're detected, then somebody thinks of mitigation, well, the attack doesn't work anymore. So the attackers are constantly getting more sophisticated, right? They're changing port numbers, they're changing packet sizes. And if we look here, right, one of the variants that came out in 2000, okay, we're talking 17 years ago, Stacheldraht. So it also used encrypted communications. So even using encryption is not new. So I like to bring up this case, and this year marks actually the 10th anniversary of the May events in 2007 in Estonia. I'm Estonian. I was actually part of the security operation trust groups at the time already. I think in 2000 when Barry Green started kind of talking to operators here at NANOG and getting people to build trusted communities so that, when you actually call somebody and say, hey, I need you to filter this, people wouldn't question you, they would just do it. Right? And so it happened that the RIPE NCC conference was in Tallinn in May 2007, and I happened to be the trusted introducer because I knew the Estonians, I knew the operation community, and I was in the NOC that evening with a bunch of others when, basically the real shit hit the fan. But one of the really interesting things there was that all of the attacks that were utilized, especially the DDoS attacks, same old shit. There was some, I don't know, I can't remember the exact number, 100,000 pings, right, from all over the place against one machine, right, one router. What do you think happened? The router couldn't handle it, right? Even today's routers, right? If you get a whole hell of packet love, and a whole lot of pings, is it going to just handle it or is it going to fall over? And so they actually ended up having, just out of pure serendipity, some of these packet scrubbers, right, and they put them in. And I had given a talk at NANOG following the May 2007 events, just about things that I could talk about. It was in one of the security BOFs that was closed at the time. But if I remember correctly, they had like 3 megabits or gigabits, can't remember, of traffic. I don't remember the exact numbers, but what I do remember is after they did all of the packet scrubbing, 1/10 of the traffic was what was legitimate, right? And so that helped them because they were just mitigating the whole time. And this is purely DDoS, right? And so one of the things that always helps is also building the trusted communities and doing it globally, right? Because these days, if somebody, wants to attack you and they want to be part of the program, or, there's a botnet that's using a large DDoS, it can come from anywhere in the world. It can come from your laptop. So also what's, very much in the norm is distributed reflector attacks. So using, again, a forged IP address of the intended victim. And this is how the open recursive DNS resolver attacks work, right, for the amplification. That then the authoritative servers send back legitimate replies, right? It looks like it's a legitimate query for them, but really it's spoofed. And then the intended victim gets, a whole bunch of traffic that they potentially can't handle. I'm sure many of you remember all the NTP stuff that happened, with the monolith stuff a couple of years ago. For those of you that don't know, there's a pointer to the actual CVE. And I absolutely loved this talk when it was given. Again, this was also, right, 2014. But it was because of all the amplification attacks that were happening in DNS and also NTP, this researcher, Christian Rousseau, I probably butchered his name, but he actually did a talk at the NDSS conference about all the different UDP-based protocols and what the impact would be if you did some kind of amplification attack. And the impact is huge, right? And we know that for NTP and for also for DNS, right? People are looking into these scenarios. But there's a whole bunch of other protocols, right? I don't know which one, like the NetBIOS, the SSDP, CharGen, QOTD, I mean, how can they be abused? And are you guys, right, who are operating networks, are you aware of these scenarios? And have you thought in your environments, how are you not somebody that will allow any of these amplification attacks to actually traverse your networks? Why do you care? Because someday maybe your infrastructure could be hit and you might need help, right? And this is the whole problem when you're thinking about DDoS. Like whenever we talk about, filtering for anti-spoofing and all that, you're not necessarily benefiting yourself, but you're benefiting the community. Until such a time that something hits you and you're like, help me, and people are like, well, what did you do for me? Right, so as a community, I was in Brazil for LACNIC, I don't know, 2 weeks ago, and there was a great talk, right, where they're like, we need to build a community where we're all helping each other, rather than pointing a finger and saying that, well, I can't do it, the equipment vendor just sucks, right? I mean, or hey, that implementer sucks, or I can't do anything. It's really all of us have to think through, well, what can I do in my realm of authority, right, to really help with the problem? And the reason that I really am very serious about we have to stop pointing the fingers, we really have to start thinking, what can we all do, was because WannaCry didn't surprise me, but I was like, shit, now it's hospitals, now it's ransomware, right? And this could be impacting somebody that I know, and quite frankly, they could die. Right? And so you can maybe keep the other eye and go, nah, not my problem, right? But I think it's gotten to the point where it's absolutely serious, and we really do have to start thinking what we can do, right? Call for action. So here's some slides from trends. There's been newer reports in the last couple of weeks from the last quarter. I mean, basically, the trends are going up. And when I look at, what the attacks are based on, UDP-based, IP fragmentation attacks, TCP-based, I mean, these are always the top 3, 4. So that's not changing. And again, UDP-based, I will point you to Amplification Hell, right? That paper was excellent work, and I'm really hoping that people will look at, well, how can UDP be misused, right? And how can we mitigate? So floods also, right, Taffic floods, NTP, SYN floods, you name it. And this is just a graph of NTP and the spike that was seen in 2014 where people are like, oh, NTP, look at that, that can be abused. Right, so as we look at the continuing trends, right, the attackers will just continue to change tactics, right, because they want their DDoSes to work. I was actually kind of surprised because I hadn't really looked at GitHub and seen what code was out there. But there exists code if you want to create something, that's malware, right? There's some great code out there where you can just say, oh, cool, okay, let me use this as a baseline. I can change the packet sizes, I can change the time of day, I can utilize encryption, I can use V6 maybe, right? So it's all canned. And so it's out there. And so I'm always going, wow, I mean, what are operators doing these days, right? Because again, I'm very well aware that as an operator, right, you are not the internet police, right? But the problem is that nobody is the internet police. So what do we do? And as I also watched what's been really different in the last 10 years or so, well, you have much more bandwidth. I live in Seattle here. I actually have the opportunity to get, 1 gigabit of traffic to my condo unit, $80 a month. I'm willing to pay that, right? That's 1 gigabit, right? I've got my Sonos system. I've got a couple of TVs. One does IPv6, yay. I got a couple of other things, right? In my device, I'm going, do I really monitor like what's being sent out of my link, right? Why would I? I got a gig, I do that though, and people laugh at me. They're like, oh, cool, you got Wireshark on. You know why? I'm not sniffing what you're doing. I'm sniffing what I'm doing. What am I sending out? What's going out of my interface, right? How many people do this? Not that many, right? My friends laugh at me. They're like, you're crazy and paranoid. I'm like, absolutely. right? And so I don't want to do that, right? But I do it. And so, we've got a lot more bandwidth available. Also, the number of devices, right? So you look at WannaCry, you look at, Mirai, and really, you got your cameras, you got other devices. They don't do any minimal security because nobody knows what minimal security requirements really should be. And the people that do, they've been doing security for 10 years and just call everybody else stupid, right? And so, this is not a surprise to me. And the biggest thing for me with WannaCry, that's the one that really hit home to me that said, the thing that's really awful right now is that you have ransomware and it's hitting hospitals and other critical things where people can die. And so it's not that any new attacks exist per se, because in my mind, it's using the same stuff that people have been using for 10, 15, 20 years. It's just you have more bandwidth, you have more devices, and the impact is much more serious. So looking at Mirai, right, 600, 700,000, 100 gigabits per second. I actually was at an Aaron meeting, and it was the last day that the biggest Mirai attack happened, right? And luckily, for some of them, but the guys at Twitter, Dine, whatever, they were all there. So they all convened in somebody's hotel room, and we're doing the mitigation. And I happened to sit next to one of the guys as we were flying back, and he was telling me, some of the real deal. Because what you see in the news is not necessarily what's really going on, right? And so it was interesting because, we all know about Mirai these days, right? You had cameras. The thing that really, and I will say this, I realize it's recorded, but yes, this pisses me off. Telnet by default, right? Using unencrypted protocols these days, this day and age, why? I have, and then having default username and passwords. Forget about just the password. I get really pissed off if I have a CPE device and I can't change the username admin. Really? You're giving somebody 50% of the information, right? So these are stupid things to me. If I look at anybody that's doing any kind of simplistic security, minimal security requirements for devices, right? I say three things. I don't want to see any default username and password. I want to see cryptographically protected protocols. And I don't mean encryption per se. I care more about integrity, right? And so just want to make sure that if I'm communicating with you, right? I'm the server and I'm sending you an update, that you know that that update came from me and nobody's played a man in the middle and can spoof that update anywhere. And then the third thing is to have firmware software upgrades. And I would challenge everybody in the room, to think through that if those three things existed in just about every device we had, how many current DDoS, new DDoSes, would not exist today? So the new normal that we have, right, is that we don't really know our traffic anymore, right? Because there's so many different devices that you have, and who knows how many TCP connections, 200, to do something, any casting, this, that, where is everything going? And so we don't really have a good understanding, from when I initiate my traffic, how many hops it's going through and what all is going on. So we're in a period of very rapid change. And I've stated this already earlier, that we have so many interconnected devices, it's just growing. And the complexity is growing, right? We have tunnel within tunnel within tunnel. And data will always continue to be stolen or modified, right? And using more subtle and more persistent techniques. So how many of you utilize IPv6? More and more. But the thing, so I used to do a lot of security training on IPv6, and I did a lot of security assessments and helped people with IPv6. And it was amazing to me how many people ran into the same thing that they did in v4, because this is not necessarily wrong, right? It's intuitive. As an operator, you just want packets to get to point A to point B, right? You're not thinking about how you limit that access right away. Like, I think you should, right? But people don't. And I have anecdotal stories where, people would slowly, get IPv6 into their environments, and, so they'd enable it on their routers. And then I'd look at their access list, and I'm like, so you haven't done any VTY access lists, for v6? And they're like, oh, you know? And then they'd, of course, tell me that, yeah, but their address space is too, so big. And I'm like, so did you use, like, that subnet, and it's : : 1 of your router address? They're like, yeah. I'm like, because we want to make it simple. But it's the fundamentals, right? So I have this slide, it's dated, but what I wanted to show, I gave this talk in January at NANOG on the road in Hawaii. I wanted to show basically how much the routing table is actually growing for v6. So I used to play a lot more than I do now in my current role, but I actually have an eBGP connection through Friends and Family ISP here locally, and I have a /48, and I wanted to watch the routing table grow. So I've been doing that for like the last 5 years. And so if you look at the difference between June of last year, right, 32,000 routes, I looked this morning at the CIDR list for v6, we're at 39,000 routes, right? So do the math, right? But I mean, we're pretty much growing. And so, and one of the things that I took a look at maybe a year ago, because I was just kind of curious, is that not comparing the v4 and the v6 routes in terms of numbers of routing table entries, but rather looking at the percentage of ASs that were doing v6 and v4. And if I remember correctly, it was maybe about a fourth. So I didn't care about the number of routes, I cared about how many ASs are doing v4 versus how many are doing v6. And so v6 is really becoming a factor, and there's a lot of botnets out there that you just have a check mark that use v6. So I'm just hoping that in your environment, you know how to deal with that if you ever get hit with a DDoS with v6. So this is my list of general good hygiene, right? And I give talks all that say going back to the basics, right? It's not just about encrypt everything, right? I mean, people have this hype, every couple of months. And you may not have sufficient bandwidth to absorb attacks, and if you don't, filtering and rate limiting is going to become more important to you. Have effective logging and alerting, right? Do you actually know that you're under a DDoS, right? Do you know your traffic levels? Is this abnormal? Are you looking into it? Hey, wow, we're getting so much from this guy, because sometimes people test, right? And so if you're not looking at the anomalies, then you might have a bigger impact. And sharing data with trusted folks, I can't emphasize enough that creating trusted communities and relationships is so important. And trust is based on people. And this NANOG community, this is where it was started. Back in 2000, I remember the meetings. We had birds of a feather sessions for security. And Barry Green was one of the bigger incentivizers to say, get to know each other, right? Because these attacks are growing. And you want to have a community that, you got to get to know your upstreams because they're the ones that are going to help you filter. So I also talk a lot about credential compromise. And I was in an environment, I worked somewhere for 6 months. So it was that environment that I was like, wow, people are really poor at credential management. And I had to think back that, yeah, what do I do, right? I remember creating my first PGP keys. I think within an hour I had created 3 keys, right? Because I was like, oh yeah, no, that password stinks. Oh yeah, this problem or that problem. And then when I'm in an environment and I look at, corporations, like who handles your TLS keys? Who handles your SSH keys? Who handles your certificates, your private key, passwords? And I look at all the credentials that are actually in an environment, and people don't have good credential lifecycle management processes. And I really started thinking about this. I'm on the Security Advisory Council of ICANN, and there's a lot of registrar hacks, right? Where, DNS authoritative servers get spoofed and all that, and domain names get compromised. But it's not just a registrar problem, it's a problem everywhere, right? When you start looking at, well, how did this compromise actually happen? Right? And usually it's, somebody popped a credential somewhere and that kind of starts the chain of reaction. And so I helped create a document that came out for the Security Advisory Council of ICANN, but it was looking at just the registry industry and, where you use different credentials, and then actually going through saying that, every time you create, change, or renew a credential, you have to think about how do you distribute, store, recover, delegate, transferring any kind of credentials, revoking and destroy it. And I would actually be surprised if a majority in this room knew or had good processes for this. And this is why I created this one slide, okay? It's a cheat sheet, crib sheet for everyone. Look at what you're doing. And the thing that really scares me sometimes with encrypt everything, I'm like, you lose your key, what happens to your data? Right? Well, just think about it. I mean, I believe in encryption. I absolutely do. And I very much believe that, and I've believed this for 15 years, I like IPsec. I've always liked IPsec because I always thought that at least if you used AH or ESP null, which is not an April Fool's RFC, which they actually listed as one until I said, people are using that. And so it's just that you're doing it for integrity purposes, right? Integrity and authentication. And I believe that every packet, if it was feasible, should be integrity protected cryptographically, right? And then if you lose the keys, well, bummer, but at least you can't validate the integrity, but you still have access to the data. But credential management is huge. So the next couple of slides, and I don't have a timer on here, so I don't know how much time I have left. But I'm giving you a bunch of information where you can check in your own environments if you haven't heard any of these talks before about looking at how you can at least help mitigate for certain well-known attacks that are part of DDoS attacks. So DNS recursive resolvers, right? It's okay if you have managed, the keyword here is managed open recursive DNS resolvers, right? These are like your Googles and some of your other environments, the 8888 and whatever else there is. But the problem is that there's many unmanaged ones, and those are the ones that are also very largely used for amplification DDoS attacks. So there's a bunch of tools where you can, figure out whether or not your environment is part of that. Also, IP address spoofing. I mean, God, 20 years we've been talking about this. Please, do anti-spoof filters, right? And so I'm a very firm believer in my house, because I test a lot of stuff and I don't want to be part of the problem. I have an egress filter that says only allow traffic that's an IPv6 part of my /48, and I do have 2/29s, and I say only allow traffic with the source IP as part of these 2/29s. Because otherwise, as I'm testing, right, if I make a configuration mistake or, fat finger something, then I might be sending crap out, right? And so for me, I don't just believe in ingress filtering, which is basically the BCP38, but I also believe that I'm responsible. So an organization, an enterprise, whatever you're sending out to the internet, make sure that you're also sending what should be valid. Now the problem with some of this, filtering is seemingly easy, but it's hard. Because if I'm in an enterprise, I also have to think about what are my backup links? Right, so I know what my normal traffic should look like in my, my CIDR blocks, but what if my primary CIDR blocks, need to use a backup path, right, because they're down. So what IP addresses do I then have to allow? So this just lists some known links where you can test for known DDoS vectors, right, for spoofing, for NTP, and for open DNS resolvers. And another crib sheet, doing the work for you. So these are some really excellent pieces of work by people. So when you're looking at BCP84 was for doing unicast reverse path forwarding with multi-homing. And so there's a guy, Pekka Savola, who used to be very active in the IETF. He's from Finland. And he actually wrote a really good draft. It never became an RFC. From experience from using URPF. So it's still really useful information. And also Securing the Edge, written by Paul Vixie. it's a security, it's an SAC document, so SAC 004, and a bunch of this other stuff. But if you read nothing else, right, just look at these 5 papers, because I think they'll give you a lot of informative information. And the Team Cumry configuration templates, right, they're awesome. I mean, like the Bogon lists and whatever, I mean, just feed that into your BGP and, you know, you're doing something. I have a couple of slides on remotely triggered black hole routing. I created some graphics on that. Primarily what it is that you prep some of your routers to be quote unquote trigger routers. And what they're doing is they're null routing some of the traffic. So once you know some DDoS traffic is hitting your infrastructure and you know what the source that it's coming from, then you can actually black hole that route. So then you set up your trigger router and you basically null route that specific block. So the problem is that if you're doing destination-based, then there's a lot of legitimate traffic that could potentially also be filtered. So then they came up with source-based remotely triggered black hole routing so that you'd have a bit more granularity. So I'm not going to go through the steps in detail, but I had created this slide because the first ones that came out had, I couldn't understand it, you know. So, but it was, to me, it's actually a very simple concept because all you're doing is you're utilizing BGP, right, to then send the information to every other BGP listener on your network to, just null route this traffic because it's part of the DDoS. But, you have to have manual intervention, right? So you have to actually prepare the trigger routers. You got to prep 1 or 2 routers that you set up. And then later on, once the attack is gone, right, you got to then stop null routing that traffic. I don't know how many of you follow the DOTS working group in the IETF, but that also deals with automated DDoS kind of handling. So the last thing I would just want to kind of talk about is that sharing, information sharing. I've been in many different environments. I've worked for a couple of different companies in the last 5 years where we're trying to promote information sharing. And partly that is because we have to share information to get better at mitigating attacks before they happen to us. And so I think the ISP community actually is really good at sharing. Like this is a good group where you know that you need to create relationships. And I don't have a problem usually here. It's more when you're dealing with banks or other environments. But what's been really interesting in hearing in financial communities or healthcare communities is that they've been reluctant to go outside of their spheres. And one of the things that I've been encouraging them to do is make sure that they involve their ISPs, right? Because as a bank or a financial institution or as a healthcare or oil and gas kind of company, I mean, there's only so much that you can share with each other, but all that traffic traverses your ISPs, right? So you want to create these cross-functional relationships because you got to work together as a team. And the thing with the criminal world is, God, they share. They love sharing information between each other. And the thing is that they don't have a problem, right? They don't have any liabilities to worry about. So while you're here, right, and if people are talking about different security-related things in your environment, maybe you're new to NANOG, right? There's a lot of newcomers here. And you're going, if something hits us and I don't know who to talk to, right? Either look me up or some other people that are talking about security and say, hey, I think I might want to get to know some people. Who should I talk to? Because we have to continuously keep networking. And if you're wondering what kind of information you should be sharing, because a lot of people are worried about PII, right? And it's actually really critical right now in Europe because next June, right, there's going to be the new data protection, whatever law, and they're actually going to get fined. Companies are going to get fined like 4% of their annual revenue, right, if they don't comply with PII things. And so I always say that, well, if you're at least sharing information about, IPs that are involved in SSH brute force attacks, the amplification attacks, or passive DNS information, you're not going to be worried about PII, right? So look at the things that don't address PII and then kind of think through all the other data. But we have to share information in terms of who's attacking you so that people can be quicker at mitigating. So if some of you aren't familiar with these groups, right, there's some specific groups that have specific purposes for global efforts to share information with each other and help each other. So DNS.org is primarily for DNS-related stuff. First, there's actually a conference next week. I'll be going there. It's about CERT teams, like either national CERT teams or company CERT teams. If you're not familiar with FIRST, I would encourage you to look that up. The special interest groups, the ISACs, and those are the ones for like mobile gas, the airline industry, automotive ISAC, manufacturing ISAC. Then you have MOG and APWG, which primarily deal with phishing and email-related issues. NSPSec, that's the one that was started in NANOG back in 2000, right? And primarily to get ISP security trusted relationships going. And then there's also OPSEC Trust, which is global and for situational awareness. But to me, these are, for this community, things that you should be aware of. So the only thing that I want to ask is that for all of you, right, I mean, some of this is old hat. You've heard about security. I know some of you here. And, you know, we're all trying to figure out, wow, I mean, what can we do, right? And so there's also from the ISOC, they created this routing manifesto. And it's basically looking at what can ISPs do in their infrastructures, right? And there's a lot of companies that have signed up to say, you know, we're going to be part of this because we want to be part of the solution. So I would very strongly encourage you guys to look at this. And it's called Manners, right? Cool acronym, you know, let's all have manners. I'm very firm about when you're managing devices these days, use only cryptographically protected protocols. Why are you using TFTP when you have SCP, right? Why are you using, I don't know, Telnet and FTP these days, right? 10 years ago, okay, I kind of get it. Today, not at all. Change all default usernames and credentials. I think the biggest impact I made in one environment I was at, I was raving about security so much, and I had an Android phone at the time. This is 6 years ago. And I found this app, and I'm like, oh, I wonder what that is. And it was like, it was called something like Router Root. And I'm like, cool name, wonder what that is. I downloaded it, and I had 3,000 devices with their default username and password and some open ports. And so there was this guy next to me in my cube, and I'm like, what's that timing device that we're using? He told me, I'm like, is that the password? He's like, how do you know? I'm like, so you haven't changed the default. Awesome, right? Which he did then later. And so it's interesting because, you know, we really do have to pay attention in terms of, are we doing the right thing and changing things from our operational environment so that we're not part of the problem. Keeping up with vulnerabilities and patches and upgrades in a timely manner. Very easy to say that, yeah, you should have patched, right? But patching does have impacts, right? If you haven't tested it, you can't just always have blind trust, right? Sometimes you're like, yep, I don't have time to always look. I'm going to always do the update when, you know, that vendor says I should do the update. But realistically, right, in practice, there are updates, even if there's security updates, that you have to look at how am I vulnerable to whatever that security update is. And if I have a large environment where I have processes in place where I've got to do certain regression tests and God knows what else, right? If I get hit with something, how do I detect that and how can I mitigate another way until I have the opportunity to patch? Right? That's the realistic what you do in practice. So that's a hard one. I was a CISO in my previous job, and that was during Heartbleed, during shell shock, during Poodle. That was fun, not, right? But you're trying to figure out what is the impact, right? How quickly can I upgrade, and what can I do to see whether or not I'm going to be hit by this, And if I am, and I haven't had a chance to upgrade yet, what do I do? And share what you can. And that is it for my talk. And I don't know if I have time for questions.
Thanks for mentioning egress filtering in regards to spoofing. That's been a pet peeve of mine for a long time. How can we detect those networks that don't have proper egress filtering and call those operators out?
So the spoofer project from CADA, it used to be called the MIT Spoofer Project, but they had spent a lot of time in the last year or two, Matthew Lucky. I have a pointer in that slide where if you download some software, you can actually test whether or not in your environment they're spoofing.
I think it's Bill, actually.
Oh, me. Hi, Marky. Bill Manning.
Hello.
Back there on, oh, I don't know, maybe slide 15 or 16, you had a pie chart that had, oh, like UDP and TCP and whatnot. Remember that?
I do, because it was from one of the Akamai or somebody's, reports. What about it?
Well, as you're going through the slides, I'm going, so many questions. But no, keep going. Yeah, that one right there. One makes the presumption that that's IPv4. Is that correct?
I would say that that is absolutely correct, because I have for probably 5 years gone around in corners and said, so what have you seen with IPv6, right? I'm only going to say that stuff has been seen. It's not going to be in these types of reports yet.
Okay, so we don't actually have an equivalent type of DDoS profile for v6. Is that correct?
That would be correct. And if there's somebody from Akamai or VeriSign, or there's some, I don't know, there's a couple other companies that are now starting to create these reports. If you want to say that I'm, erroneous here, please speak up.
So, ergo, v6 has no security problems.
Like I said, it might not be public.
Hi, Medica. Aaron Hughes, 6Connect. Thank you, as always, for beating the security drum and helping us and remind us to implement better practices in protecting our infrastructure and the internet as a whole. I, at my house, like you, sniff my traffic. I have a lot of interesting consumer electronics vendors, and I see a lot of garbage that gets sent out constantly. I find that I reach out to vendors directly, weekly at least, sometimes more frequently than that. And I'm wondering if there's a forum in which you've been a part of or can recommend where we can actually start to get this message out to the CES hardware manufacturers and software developers. Because in this room, I see people are generally speaking at least responsible and understand the concept of security better than what I see coming out of the consumer electronics world. But I don't really see a forum for having conversations about better standards in that space. Do you have suggestions for that?
I may in about 2 weeks. And the reason I say that is I have been in 6 different countries in the last 4 weeks in different conferences. I've seen you at least one of them. And there's obviously a lot of talk about IoT and what can we do. And so I was part of an IEEE IoT, like security workshop. There's also the RIPE NCC is looking at what to do with requirements. At the IETF 2 months ago, there was, somebody talking about, yep, we do certifications and want to know. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do is figure out who are all the global entities that are looking at creating minimal security requirements and standards for IoT devices, because I would like for them to collaborate and be not similar yet not, but actually be the same, so that when vendors, are looking for specification, that they have a unified minimum security requirement. So I don't have the answer yet, but I'm actually working on it.
Thanks for the continued effort in the space.
Hi, Mike Sinatra, ESNet. This may be a better question for the IETF, but I'll ask it here anyway. I know that Paul Vixie has made some statements about UDP in general, and whether, since that's actually a good slide to have up, if we have 49% of our attacks coming from UDP, what does that mean about UDP? do we actually try to come up with something that's better, or do we actually try to push for things like SCTP to actually get adopted, which is not going very fast? Or do we continue to play whack-a-mole with the individual implementations, disabling monoliths, disabling or doing minimal any responses, things like that, that we've kind of done with each individual protocol? What are your opinions on that? What do you think we can do?
I'm thinking, because part of the issue is that certain protocols that run on UDP are using UDP for a reason, right? And I mean, DNS is one of them where you're going, well, should everybody go to TCP? And then, there's issues there. So I haven't thought enough about it to make a definitive, to give you a definitive answer. But I do think that this is something that at the IETF, right, the people that are defining the protocols and trying to figure out how do you provide better, consistent implementations so that operators don't have to learn so much to try and correct what the implementations are doing as a default. So I don't know, I don't have an answer for you, but I do think that we need to think about it.
Hi, I'm Ofer from Incapsula, a DDoS mitigation provider. First off, regarding the IPv6 question, it's a great question. I get it from a lot of our customers. Two parts of this question. One is there are not many IPv6 botnets because it's harder to scan the IPv6 IP range. Secondly, the devices that have IPv6 connectivity are usually more high-end, so they're more secure by nature. And most importantly, DDoS is about the targets themselves. If you don't have a lot of IPv6 targets, it doesn't make sense to create an IPv6 botnet only for one or two targets. If you're asking me, maybe I think then maybe NANOG 74 we'll see more IPv6 DDoS attacks, but right now there's not enough targets, so it doesn't make sense to create a botnet. First of all, and I wanted to say, great presentation. I think the call to action on DDoS and awareness is great. I want to talk about one thing that I think you didn't talk about, which is very important. There's a lot of talk about bandwidth, and I think bandwidth is the least of the problems with DDoS mitigation. Bandwidth is like Moore's law, it just keeps increasing every year. Bigger attacks are not more complex. That's kind of a false premise. The attacks that, I don't know if there's guys from Dyn here, it doesn't necessarily have to be like a 1 terabit attacks. I don't think we have any proof for 1 terabit attacks, but that's not the big thing. The big thing is attackers know what the soft spots with mitigations are, and things like high packets per second are more important because you need to filter the packets. I don't filter bits, I filter packets. When I have something that looks legitimate, if I'm talking about amplification attacks, then traffic isn't legitimate. It's really easy to filter.
I'm just giving you a time warning because we're getting close to the end of Q&A here, so if you can get to your
Sorry.
question.
So I'm just saying, so complex attacks don't mean bigger attacks. Attackers are changing vectors every 5 seconds with things that look legitimate. So you need a mitigation solution that needs to react fast and to handle a lot of packets per second. That's scrubbing capacity. I think this is the biggest trend we're seeing. So attackers are not necessarily looking for more amplification vectors, which are more of the same, but really to take down a target, most targets are not more than 1 gigabit in bandwidth. I just need that one gigabit that passes through.
Okay, so I am going to, we can talk offline about this, but I'm going to just make a statement in that in your environments, right, look to see if you get hit by a DDoS of V6 next week, are you ready for that? Because I'm going to negate what this gentleman was saying, because I look at T-Mobile here, I look at other entities where there's a lot more connectivity end-to-end in V6 than people realize, and I know this for a fact, because I've been in different environments and I wanted certain things to happen, and they're like, oh, you want to look at my network configuration? And they actually have a global accessible V6 address, and most mobile devices will do V6. And so all I'm going to ask is, there's all these people, V6 is ready, it's not here, it's whatever. I'm like, game over. Yeah, it's here. And so in your environments, if you had a V6 DDoS next week, are you ready? Just look to see about that in your environments.
Yeah, and actually, we're all out of time for Q&A, but you are more than welcome to follow up with the speaker directly for any more questions. So, big hand for America, everybody.